Hello! How's everybody doing? It's Friday again. I'm going to pick up where we left off. If I remember correctly, we had just finished talking about the problems that the Native Americans had been having with the English settlers early on, and how by the time you get to the end of the 1600s, slowly but surely, Native Americans had been pushed to the base of the Appalachian Mountain chain. And really, as we're going into the 1700s, those who hadn't already been forced west of the Appalachian Mountains will be forced west of the Appalachian Mountains. And that brings us to what we're going to do from this point forward for the next several chapters is talk about life in the colonies. The rest of this chapter and through chapter 3, I'll be talking about individual colonies, how they got founded around, when they got founded, how they got founded, a little bit about what basic life was like getting that colony established, and then moving towards whether it was going from being a private colony to a royal colony. Really, and then when we get into chapter 2 is about the southern colonies, the plantation colonies. Then chapter 3 is about the establishment of the New England colonies, the middle colonies. The book really doesn't go chronologically putting things in order. What they end up doing is they look at the establishment of the colonies regionally, and by region, then they tend to go, well, when you're looking at the southern colonies, Virginia was the first, then Maryland, and all the way down the list. Then when we get into chapter 3, it'll jump into New England, talk about how life was established in the colonies in New England. Then we kind of backtrack in time and we talk about where the middle colonies came from. Chapter 4 and chapter 5, I should end up going through those fairly quickly because those chapters are both overviews of colonial life as a whole, what was going on in the 13 American colonies during the 1600, or from 1607 until 1700, and then from 1700 all the way up until the eve of the American Revolution. That's all we need to worry about right now. Once we get into chapter 6, that'll be about the French and Indian War and how the French and Indian War kind of geared up towards the French and Indian War. The way that it ended, it basically set the stage for the American Revolution. And then after we get through the French and Indian War, 7, 8, 9, we'll be talking about the American Revolution and becoming our own nation. Chapter 10 and beyond will just be the building of our nation and the progression through our country's history. Now, where I left off, got to this slide, Virginia, child of tobacco. Tobacco was the cash crop for the southern colonies in general, but specifically Virginia. This was something that the colonists learned to grow from Native Americans in the region. As I talked about before, how the natives had been helpful in terms, once John Smith came along and you had an alliance formed between Pocahontas's tribe and the settlers at Jamestown, one of the things that you see them adopt is the growing of tobacco. It ends up becoming a cash crop. It never hurts when your cash crop is mildly addictive to its users, but tobacco usage takes Europe by storm. King James, the King of England, when colonization begins, absolutely hated tobacco. He detested it. Actually, I think he referred to tobacco as a detestable weed because, whether it's pipe smoke or cigarette smoke, whether it's people chewing cured tobacco and then they have to have somewhere to spit the juice, he did not like tobacco as a product, but you can't deny the fact that it was making England money. So he viewed tobacco as a necessary evil. John Rolfe, who I'd mentioned before, he ends up being married to Pocahontas in, I believe, 1517 was the year that they got married. Or sorry, 1617 was the year that they got married, if I'm correct. Uh, Husband of Pocahontas. He is looked at as, he's called the father of the tobacco industry in your book. I wouldn't say he was the first to grow. He wasn't the first plantation owner. He was one of the earliest. But the reason he's looked at as the father of the tobacco industry is because he was one of the first to become very successful at it. Now, to be very successful as a plantation owner growing tobacco, that's a misconception a lot of people have, is just because you had people that had a plantation in the South that they were wealthy. That's not necessarily the case. Just because you had a large amount of land didn't mean that all of the land was good, high producing farmland. Some of it may have been very poor soil. If you've ever heard the expression, especially being in a more rural area like this, that somebody is dirt poor, that saying's been around for years and years and years. If you were dirt poor back in the colonial days, if you were, the early American period, if you were dirt poor, it just meant that you owned bad land. Things didn't grow very well there. Rolfe had a plantation like many other, wealthier landowners in the Virginia colony, but his connection to the Native Americans and the fact that he was one of the first to adopt some of their curing methods makes his tobacco some of the highest quality. Therefore, his tobacco sells at a premium, so he makes more money. He makes more money. He can buy more land. He can pay to bring more indentured servants over, have them work the land, because that's the thing. As you gain more land, you're going to need more bodies to work the fields. He does start to share the method of curing tobacco with certain individuals, and as time goes on, he shows one person how to do it, and maybe he doesn't show other individuals because they're rivals that maybe they don't really care for each other. But as more people, more of the colonists in the Virginia colony learn this method for curing the tobacco plants, again, higher quality, demand's going to go through the roof. Demand for tobacco in Europe in general was already very high. Like I said, it never hurts when your product is mildly addictive. As the colonists start to push westward to expand farmland, that's when, the 1720s, 1740s, when I talked about the first Anglo-Powhatan War, second Anglo-Powhatan War, as the English start to push farther to the west, that's when they're, because they've already, maybe a generation earlier, they had already asked Native Americans, if you let us have this land here and you move west of this stream or this river, we'll leave you alone. We just need some room to expand. Well, the problem is, after 4 or 5, definitely 10 years farming that same patch of land, just using tobacco is very hard on the soil, and it draws the nutrients that tobacco needs to grow. It really saps those nutrients out of the soil. And if you continue to grow the same crop in the same soil year after year after year, you run into an issue called soil depletion. Well, what happens is tobacco was really the only crop that made any money for the landowners in Virginia. So that's what everybody grew, because everybody's looking for a way to make a buck. As you continue to grow the same, as you continue to grow tobacco in the same soil year after year after year, and if you're not a huge landowner that has hundreds of acres, if you're a small, that's why you didn't have very many small subsistence farms. If you can only afford 10 acres, well, after a few years, your crops are going to fall into decline. It's going to affect the quality of the tobacco. The plants are going to be stunted. They're not going to grow as tall and as healthy. So what happens is your tobacco is not going to sell very well when you take it to market. Well, since you don't make as much off of this year's crop, that's going to affect you being able to pay off debts. You're not going to be able to put back enough money to buy more acreage of fresh land to be able to plant tobacco where it would grow healthier. So you're going to be stuck next year using the same small plot of land. Your yield's going to be even worse. Therefore, your tobacco is going to be one of the last to sell, and it's not going to sell for as much money as people that have good sustained land. Now, this ends up creating a situation where, as they need to clear more land so they can grow more tobacco in nutrient-rich soil. It's going to cause conflict with the Native Americans, but also as these farms end up turning into plantations, and they're huge, sprawling hundreds, over, maybe in some cases over 1,000 acres on some of these plantations, it's going to increase the demand for labor. Well, that also creates a reason I've already touched on. There was a market there for people that would want to leave England, want to leave Wales, want to leave Scotland, Ireland, or non-English European countries, because people felt crowded, because people didn't make a very consistent, stable living in England. Because like I said, the population had grown greatly over the previous 50 years. You've got people that are losing their jobs because landowners were putting fences up so livestock could graze. That cut down on the land that was available to grow crops. There's a huge demand for labor in the New World, in the colonies that are being established, whether it's Virginia or a little later on Maryland, whatever the case. So people that had the money or had the ability to sign themselves into indentured servitude, that pays for their passage across the Atlantic. Then when they get to Virginia, indentured servitude is essentially contracted slave labor. The way that English landowners looked at indentured servants, at this point, it wasn't about race. You were either a landowner or you were a servant. Indentured servants did the same thing that was expected of slaves, but it was for a contracted period of time, generally 7 years. Landowners paid to bring you from England or to bring you from Wales to Virginia, and for 7 years, that landowner basically owned you. You would work in their household, you'd work on their farmland, whatever the case might be. When your contract was up, your debt was paid, and you were free to go do whatever. The problem is, it's just like a slave. Indentured servants didn't really get paid for their labor, so when that 7 years was up, they might be given if you want to look at it like a parting gift or whatever, they might be given 20 pounds of cornmeal or 10 pounds of cornmeal, 10 pounds of flour, maybe a very small amount of money. Usually there wasn't any financial compensation. And when I say a small amount, maybe $30, $50, something like that, but more than likely not. You might be given, like I said, some cornmeal, some flour, things like that, because now the landowner is not responsible for your well-being. This was, like I said, sort of like a parting gift. You're on your own. Well, you don't have any money to buy land of your own, so in a lot of cases, you'd have to sign a contract with the person that your contract just ran out with, not as an indentured servant, but as a tenant farmer, where essentially you get to continue working this other person's land, but instead of being an indentured servant, your rent that you pay every year is based off of the amount of land that you're contracting for. And they would have a formula that would say you should be able to grow this many pounds of tobacco. And based off of that, I expect a minimum of X poundage so many pounds, or if you grow beyond that, I expect 70% of what you grow. So these contracts would not be very fair, and it would be very hard for a tenant farmer to ever make enough money, sell enough of that extra. If you had to turn over 75% of what you grew, that only left you with 30% of your harvest to sell and profit from. And you're going to have outstanding debts from the year that you have to pay off. You're going to maybe be able to stick some back, but that money is going to have to get you through to the next harvest the following year. So it was usually a situation where the landowners kind of stacked the deck against the renters to where they were never going to be able to buy land on their own. That's going to come back to bite the landowners in Virginia in the rear end. We'll talk about that in chapter 4, chapter 5. Now, I told you James I did not like Virginia's private charter, even though he did not like tobacco as a cash crop. Again, you can't deny that it made money. James I ends up revoking Virginia's private charter, and it becomes a royal colony in 1624, which meant that now the Virginia colony, you don't pay rent or you don't pay taxes, or if you buy land, the Virginia company is not going to be making any more money off of the Virginia colony. After 1624, this is now a territory that belongs to the crown, and the people of Virginia have to pay taxes directly to the crown. Again, at this point, indentured servitude is what is driving the labor force in the colonies. As of 1619, when tobacco's starting to take off in Virginia, records indicate that the first purchase of African slaves was made from a Dutch warship off the coast of Jamestown, and even by 1700, African slaves only made up about 14% of the total colonial population. Of course, the percentage would be a little higher than that in the South, but by 1700 there were slaves in the North. They just weren't as needed by landowners because you didn't have the big sprawling plantations. In the North, you generally dealt with smaller family farms. But slave labor is really going to take off late 1600s going into the 1700s, and that's when you're really going to see the total colonial population slice of the pie graph. That's going to change as you have the transition from indentured servitude into the use of African slave labor in the beginning of the 1700s. The state of Maryland. Maryland was founded, it got its charter in 1634. It was intended to be a safe haven for Catholics because since Henry VIII started the Church of England, and the Church of England by this point, we're talking probably almost 100 years after the founding of the Church of England, that Catholics were being persecuted. And you've got a situation where you did still have, like Lord Baltimore, which of course, city of Baltimore in Maryland is named after the founder of the Maryland colony. Lord Baltimore and his family was Catholic, and there were other prominent Catholic families in England that were persecuted, that were kept from holding certain titles, certain offices, military positions, because of laws that had been passed to discriminate against Catholics in Protestant England. His plan was, he got this portion of land granted by the king, and this was kind of if you give us this, I will do what I can to get as many Catholics out of your hair here in England as possible. So the king agrees, sets up a charter, and again, this is going to be a private charter. It would be run by Baltimore and his family. The plan was to sell off land that he was given in this grant to other Catholic families. Now, of course, he would give land grants to his members of his family, but other Catholic families that wanted to leave the persecution of England behind, they would be able to buy land from Baltimore. And this was going to be, like a Catholic safe haven. Well, that only lasted as long as they didn't set up plantations and need labor, because what happens is by the time you get to 1634, most of the people in England had finally given in to Henry's law with the Act of Supremacy, and where the Church of England was declared the only legal church in the country. A lot of English had converted to the Anglican faith, and the people that are coming over as indentured servants, they tend to be Protestant. In Maryland, the landowners tended to be Catholic. And you still have that animosity between Catholics and Protestants, but now it's also socioeconomic. The Catholics who were persecuted back in England are now in a position of power, but the Protestants who feel, or are at least afraid, that those Catholic landowners will now take this opportunity where the roles are reversed, they're afraid that they will use this opportunity to now persecute the Protestants. The only thing is that the Protestants outnumbered the Catholics in Maryland 75% to 25%, and maybe even more so than that. So there is potential here for a lot of social upheaval. And because these tensions, it didn't quite spill over into violence, but it was getting to the point where it looks like it could happen at any point. There has to be some sort of agreement, or the Protestant planters, the Protestant workers, they wanted something in writing that said our religious rights will be protected, that you're not going to be legally allowed to persecute us because of our faith, even though the same thing did happen to Catholics back home in England. So like Virginia, Maryland, like I said, depended heavily on white indentured servants. African slaves aren't going to be imported in very large numbers at all until, like I said, the end of the 1600s, early 1700s. Baltimore had promised freedom of worship from the very beginning of the establishment of the colony. But as large numbers of Protestant settlers end up coming in, like I said, they were afraid that the Catholic landowners would end up persecuting them. That leads to 15 years after the colony's founding, the Act of Toleration. It guarantees religious toleration to all Christians. Now, even though Baltimore had permitted freedom of worship from the beginning, the Act of Toleration technically reduced religious freedom. It promised religious toleration to all Christians. But now you don't have full freedom of worship. After the Act of Toleration is passed in the colony of Maryland, now non-Christians could be put to death. So even though it was supposed to guarantee religious freedom for English Protestants, it actually reduced overall religious freedom by promising the death penalty for any non-Christians that were discovered. That's something that you generally kept to yourself if you came over as a Jewish immigrant. If there were some non-Christian groups other than the Jewish faith that weren't tolerated by Catholics or by Protestants. Even some groups of Christians that didn't see eye to eye still might end up falling under ridicule by the Protestants or the Catholics. Now, the West Indies, technically not part of the English colonies in North America, but they were English colonies. One of the things that you have to realize here is, I've talked about tobacco as a cash crop so far. The West Indies, by the time you get into the mid to late 1600s, especially after 1588, the defeat of the Spanish Armada as they tried to invade England, you've got a situation by the time you get into the 1650s, definitely by the time you get to 1700, England had used their naval power and the decline of Spain to start little by little taking islands from the Spanish. So as they take over more Caribbean islands, they take control of the sugar trade. Spain loosened its grip on the Caribbean islands by the early 1600s, but it wasn't by choice. It was just because they didn't have the power, they didn't have the naval strength to hold those islands anymore. England in 1655, England managed to gain control of Jamaica, which was the largest, even though it's not the largest island, it was the largest producer of sugarcane at that point in time. Tobacco is viewed as a poor man's crop because anybody, if you have 20 acres, you could grow enough tobacco to pay your bills, to be able to set back a little money to save, to buy more land in the future. But anybody could grow tobacco. Sugarcane, tobacco was a poor man's crop. Sugarcane was a rich man's crop or a wealthy man's crop. You had to have a lot of money to grow sugarcane to begin with. Sugarcane is very labor intensive. It took a lot of land, and on these islands in the Caribbean where it grows. Now you can grow sugarcane. I mean, there's sugarcane that grows in Breckinridge County. You go out towards Clover Creek, Stephensport, Yellowbank, all of those areas, people, I know people that have sugarcane. It just grows naturally on their farm. But even though it will grow here, in Hancock County, there are people that produce molasses from sugarcane. But even though it will grow this far north, it just grows that much better in the Caribbean climate. So hot, so humid, the cane, it grows like wildfire. But it takes a lot of land. It's very labor intensive. You've got to have a lot of manpower in the fields to tend and to harvest. You've got to have a large crew to transport the cane from the fields to the refineries. You have to have people working in the refineries. Tobacco wasn't that labor intensive. You could have 10 acres, 20 acres, and you could work it with your family. It went easier if you had indentured servants or slaves to help. But tobacco didn't take a lot of land. It didn't take a lot of money. That's why it was looked at as poor man's crop. You had to have money because with sugarcane, you had to have money because it grew on the islands in the Caribbean. And the big thing about islands is real estate, supply and demand. Continental North America, vast continent, plenty of land. On these islands in the Caribbean, land is at a premium. There's only so much of it there. So if you wanted to buy into the sugar trade, if you wanted to buy land in Jamaica or some of the islands in the Bahamas, it's going to cost you a lot of money because there's not that much land to go around down there. That's why I say you have to have money up front. And then you've got to be able to either bring in indentured servants or later on, the Spanish had already converted to slave labor. So as the English start to take over the Caribbean islands, they adopt African slave labor in the Caribbean, not in the colonies in North America yet. Like I said, enormous number of African slaves were brought into the Caribbean even before the English end up taking over the sugar trade. From 1640 to 1690, when the English were starting to really spread out and take more islands from the Spanish, they see that the African slave labor is useful and cheaper than bringing in indentured servants from England because you're not having to pay for their transportation like that. So it worked for the Spanish. It seems to work. Therefore, the English continue. They up the import of African slaves into the Caribbean. On a lot of islands, or just in the Caribbean, English islands in the Caribbean in general, by 1700, African slaves outnumbered white settlers 4-1. So they made up 80% of the population on most of those islands. To keep such a disproportionate population under control, in check, you had most islands, most of these English colonies, they set up law codes specifically geared towards slaves, like the Barbados Slave Code, which was passed in 1661. As you start to see African slave labor be adopted in the American colonies, you're going to start to see slave codes, anywhere where there's a large slave population, there are going to be slave laws. Things that say, if slaves are running errands, if you, want to put it that way, you look at it like, okay, they have to have papers showing where they're going, who they're working for, who their owner is, things like that, where if they're stopped by any authorities, they can show that they're not just wandering around, or they're not runaway slaves. That, it's kind of like if when you were in elementary school, if you were going to run an errand for the teacher and they gave you a note, well, if another teacher stopped you in the hallway, you could show them that note, said, I'm going to the office to get something for your teacher. A slave's papers were like that. If they traveled, now generally they didn't travel by themselves. They would have a supervisor with them, but from time to time it did happen. There would be laws that say that it was illegal to teach a slave to read and write, because that created a social separation between white settlers and African slaves. And again, that's something that you see end up being adopted as slave labor is picked up in the American colonies. And again, you look in the chapter, look at stuff about the Barbados Slave Code, and you can pick up a few more details about that. But it was basically just laws in place to keep the slave population manageable. Now, again, sugar plantations soon crowded out all other forms of Caribbean agriculture. You keep bringing more and more people into the islands, more slaves into the islands to work, to grow sugarcane. So you grow more sugarcane because that makes more money. But the more sugarcane you grow, because land is limited, that means that you can't grow other stuff like food. So the islands end up becoming dependent on the mainland for food. Farmers on not tobacco plantations, but farmers that grow, food crops, they had a place, they had markets readily available, because you grow rice, you grow corn, you grow wheat that can be sent to Barbados or to the Bahamas or to Jamaica, and you already have a market ready to take those, as much of that crop as you can sell, as much as you can grow. Those islands will buy it because they can't grow the food themselves, or they're choosing not to grow the food themselves, I guess I should say. Now, with the Carolinas, you see Virginia's the first established colony. Maryland isn't too terribly far behind, established in 1634. Then you're going to see a long break before any more southern colonies, any colonies for that matter. 1630s into really up until the 1660s, because you have the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651. Then you have the restoration of the Stuart line, with King Charles II taking the throne. During the Civil War, the establishment of what was called the English Commonwealth, run by Oliver Cromwell, and then the restoration of the Stuart dynasty, that stopped. That puts a halt, kind of like how England wasn't establishing colonies prior to 1607. They had too much going on at home to establish new colonies for several decades. It's not going to be until King Charles II was king for 10 years. Finally, 10 years after he took the throne, things had kind of gotten back to normal. And as a way to reward some of the noble lords that had supported him early in his reign, the Carolina colony, which goes back into Old English and also into the Frankish kingdom, which was mainland. The Frankish kingdom ended up becoming France, but Carolina was named after King Charles II. It was founded when the king ends up giving a land grant to 8 nobles that had given him the most support. They were known as the Lords Proprietors. They did not move to the Carolina colony. They did not, they were basically absentee owners. They stayed at home in England. But what this was is it was a land grant that if you go from the uh, dividing line between the southern boundary of Virginia, northern boundary of North Carolina, and the southern point of South Carolina. The land grant went all the way across, even though they hadn't made it to the Pacific Ocean yet over land. The land grant said basically the strip of land from this point in the north to this point in the south, the Lord's proprietors got to control all of that, even though, there might be French claims to land west of the English colonies or Spanish claims even farther west than that. In the original charter, all of that land was supposed to belong to the Lord's proprietors, and then those 8 families would divide the land up amongst themselves. The initial plan for the Carolina colonies to make money was, we're going to start selling land to people that want to invest, start plantations, and the plan was to grow things like rice, grow food to be turned around and sold to the markets in the Caribbean islands. This was looked at as the perfect way to make money for people that wanted to start up plantations here. And rice was the primary thing. It was, while you did need labor to grow it, it was bountiful, once you got the land prepared. And the fact that African slaves were being used in the Carolina colonies, African slaves were, had at this point had learned to grow rice, so you wouldn't have to teach them how to grow, harvest, things like that, because the Portuguese, the Dutch, they had already introduced rice, where rice came from the east, they had already introduced rice to West Africa. So as slaves were being taken from West Africa and brought to the New World, rice was already a staple of their diet. Now, a lot of the initial settlers of the Carolina colony actually came from Caribbean islands. English landowners that decided that sugarcane, while it made a lot of money, it was too much trouble. So what they did is they could, because people were always willing to buy land in the Caribbean, they could sell their sugarcane plantation off, take their slaves with them, buy land much cheaper. They could get much more land in the Carolina colony, take their slaves with them, and they're going to start farming and growing rice to turn around and sell it. And the way they looked at it, they could maybe make as good a living off of growing rice to sell to the sugarcane plantations as they would have otherwise. Rice becomes the chief export. There were other exports, but rice was the big one that made the most money. Charlestown, named after King Charles, eventually becomes Charleston, South Carolina, ends up becoming an aristocratic center and the busiest seaport overall throughout all of the southern colonies. Where North Carolina and South Carolina split, what happens is the wealthy landowning type, they tend to settle, even if they owned land in what would be North Carolina, they tended to live in Charleston or Charlestown. And then they would pay supervisors to watch over the farmland. Well, over time, because of the socioeconomic differences, you had plenty of poor subsistence farmers that lived in the Carolinas that had come over as indentured servants, ended up being tenant farmers. Well, eventually, they don't really, the two groups don't blend, the wealthy landowners and the poorer tenant farmers. So over time, the poorer tenant farmers might have gotten tired of being around the snobbish, wealthy farther south. So they just kind of drift north into unclaimed land or largely unsettled land in North Carolina. And they just kind of, squat on land that belonged to somebody else. But of course, these landowners had so much land. And since they weren't heavily settled in what would become North Carolina, what they end up doing is they just squat, they grow enough tobacco. They don't want to be noticed by anybody. They try to stay very far away from any established settlements, maybe even go as far as when they harvest their tobacco, they don't go south to the markets in around Charleston. They go north and they try to sell their tobacco somewhere in Virginia. And then they're just really shady and very quiet. They don't volunteer any information about where they live, where this tobacco is coming from. In 1712, the Crown officially separates South Carolina and North Carolina. They promptly they basically revoke the private charter that Charles had given the Lords Proprietors in 1712. North Carolina and South Carolina become their own separate royal colonies. North Carolina, while it was poorer and it was looked down upon by the wealthy aristocrats in Virginia and to the south in South Carolina, they tended to be the most democratic. They tend to be the most independent and the least aristocratic, not necessarily the most poor, but the least snobbish, more welcoming, or at least more accepting of just about any of the colonies. North Carolina was the most democratic, most independent in the South, and Rhode Island, that we'll talk about later, ends up being the most independent, democratic, liberal-minded of the New England colonies. Now, because in the Carolinas, specifically North Carolina, these people tended to be on the frontier. They tended to be on the edge of the frontier. They tend to come into contact with Native Americans, and because they either didn't want to draw attention to themselves or they're so far away from any major settlements, by the time they got to ask for help or by the time help would arrive, it probably would have been too late. People that lived on the frontiers, they banded together, they helped take care of each other, and if there was any problem from Native American raiding parties, war parties that were tired of being pushed around by the English settlers, the Carolinians, they ended up having some very bloody fights over the years with native tribes in that region. By the time you get to 1720, coastal tribes, Native American tribes all up and down the Atlantic seaboard had pretty much been wiped out, but stronger inland tribes, they managed to keep the British advancement west under control until about 1770 or so. Once we get to the years leading up to the American Revolution, by that point the English pretty much controlled everything between the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachian Mountain chain, all up and down, north to south. The last two slides I want to cover here, Georgia, the last of the southern plantation colonies. It was formally founded as a colony. People had lived there before this point, but it was formally founded as a colony in 1733. It was the last of the 13 original colonies, American colonies, to be formalized. It never was heavily populated. It was slow growing, and part of that had to do with the British government itself. Georgia was named after King George II. Georgia was not a safe place to live. It wasn't intended to be a major populous colony, which is ironic because Atlanta is possibly what you would consider southern cities. Atlanta is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, city in the Deep South today, but it was very sparsely populated as a colony. Because of who populated Georgia originally, and also where it lay. It's south of South Carolina, and it was meant to be a buffer to protect the wealthy individuals of South Carolina from the Spanish in Florida, the French to the west in Louisiana, and also the Native Americans, all throughout that region, whether you're going from Florida all the way over to the Mississippi River. Georgia was there to be, if the Spanish try to push towards English settlements, they've got to get through Georgia before they can get to South Carolina. If the French try to get aggressive, they're going to have to move through Georgia territory before they can get to South Carolina. Another thing is to get people living there and to solve the problem of prison overcrowding in England, because there were so many things that could get you thrown in jail in England in the 16 and 1700s. I mean, good grief, in the early 1800s, they established the country of Australia as a prison colony just to relieve the overpopulation of English prisons. Well, in the 1700s, they start releasing some people that committed violent crimes, but mostly people that were being released from what they called debtors' prisons. If you owed money to someone and you defaulted on a loan, you could get sent to prison for that. Just like if somebody doesn't pay their taxes, if you don't pay your taxes, the IRS could end up charging you, and you could end up getting sent to prison. Well, that's one of the things that gives Georgia such a bad reputation, is the other colonies don't want to deal with people from Georgia because, all the people down in Georgia, they're just criminals. The only reason they're here is because they kicked them out of prisons back in England. So, it didn't matter whether you were a good person or not, whether you were a hard worker or not. If you lived in Georgia, you carried a stigma of, well, everybody in Georgia is a criminal anyway. Their main cash crops, they produced silk, they produced wine. Of course, they grew other crops. Eventually, cotton will catch on just like it does everywhere else in the South, but that's a little farther down the road once we get into the European Industrial Revolution and you have an increased desire for cotton. They grew a little bit of rice like they did in South Carolina. They grew some tobacco. They grew some other grains. So in Georgia, they basically grew whatever they could to make money. One name to remember, James Oglethorpe from Georgia. He ended up leading the defense of Georgia to repel Spanish attacks. He basically led the Georgia militia. I guess you could look at it that way, even though it might not have had a formal name at the time. Also, at different points, he personally saved the colony financially by mortgaging all of the plantation, all of the land that he owned. He took out a loan against his land to help pay for colonial expenses to keep the colony from collapsing. Now, in Georgia, all Christians except for Catholics. Like I said, this is an English colony, and by this point, far and wide, most English were Protestants. And there was a lot of animosity between Protestants and Catholics in England and Ireland especially. So it wasn't uncommon for English Protestants to have a very low opinion of Catholics, regardless of where they were from. All Christians were equally tolerated with the exception of Catholics. Missionaries came from all over to Georgia to work among these former inmates, that's what I mean by debtors, Native Americans. Now, the Methodist faith was founded by John Wesley in England. And as he was trying to build his church, build his following, he made several trips to Georgia and ended up being very successful establishing a branch of the Methodist Church in Georgia. And then, of course, it would spread from there throughout the English colonies as time went on. But it was because, he found a flock in Georgia because these people were rejected by just about everyone else in the American colonies. So, they were very open to hearing a message from, anybody that was willing to deal with them, willing to talk to them. We're going to wrap up here with the last slide, just talking about the plantation colonies in general. I say certain characteristics were shared by all southern mainland colonies. In some form or another, they were all devoted to growing different types of agriculture. What the main cash crop was just depended on where you were at. It may have been tobacco, it may have been rice or indigo. You get into the islands, like I said, sugarcane by far was the biggest moneymaker as far as any of the cash crops went. But on the mainland, tobacco tended to be the biggest cash crop until cotton ends up being adopted. And once there's a market for cotton, everybody stops growing pretty much everything else in the Deep South, and they convert to cotton production. Now, because what you'll see compared to the New England colonies, when we talk about those in Chapter 3, the southern colonies, they tended to be more sparsely populated, because when you had these plantations that are 500, 600, 1,000 acres, and the families, the people that farm this land, they're all spread out. The farther you are, you have to realize transportation didn't exist at this point like it does today. It's nothing for us to jump in a vehicle in most cases. It's nothing for you to jump in a vehicle and drive, especially living here in Breckinridge County. To really do anything, we've got to drive, 35 miles to E-Town, or 50 miles to Owensboro, 60 miles to Louisville, 60 miles to Bowling Green, 70 miles to Evansville, but it's because transportation is so much easier now. When you're traveling on foot, and at this point, as the colonies are being built, you didn't have roads. The roads had to be built. And in the South, most of the roads are going to just be dirt paths. Well, when the grass gets worn off and it is just a dirt path, well, if it has high traffic and it's rainy, or after the spring thaw and the ground is soft, that ground gets churned up and muddy, and you can't transport goods. You can't take a wagon. A horse could break a leg, go lame, and then you have to put that horse down, and then you lose that horse. You could get a wagon stuck in a muddy, bogged down road, and that could cause, unnecessary repairs. You break a wagon wheel, you break an axle, something like that. So people didn't really travel too far away from where they lived. It's something travel is something we really take for granted in today's world. When you can, from here, drive to Louisville an hour, go to the airport, get on an airplane, and in 4 hours you can be in Los Angeles. If you're walking on foot, it could take you 3 days. If you had to travel on foot at this point in history, it would probably take you at least 3 days, if not 5 days, to reach what is now Louisville. So, we really take how fast transportation moves for granted here in today's day and age. All plantation colonies permitted some form of religious toleration, but it might be only tolerating Protestants. It might only be tolerating Christians in general. It might be, and you'll see this in some of the northern plantations, or northern colonies especially, is that on occasion you might have one colony that tolerated every religion. That didn't happen very often, but it did happen from time to time. And also, to some extent, all colonies were expansionary. They start off with coastal claims, and as time goes on, more and more people come into the colony spreads farther to the west. Soil depletion from tobacco farming is going to continue to drive settlers to push, or as things become more crowded, as people want to, people come into the colony and they want to buy land, well, all the land close to the coast has already been purchased. They're going to have to go farther inland to find land. And of course, the farther inland they go, the more likely they are to come into contact with Native Americans. And because Native Americans from the coast in 1600 have now been pushed off the coast inland, that's going to increase the concentration of Native Americans. And as you have more and more Native Americans that have had negative experiences with the English colonists, French colonists, Spanish colonists, their reaction to more colonists pushing farther inland is going to be more and more negative and more likely violent. Some of these ideas, even though this is referring to the plantation colonies, some of these ideas will end up popping up again in Chapter 3 as I start talking about the New England and the Middle colonies, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. That is all that I have to talk about in this video, so I will see you when I see you. Again, just a reminder, anybody, if you ever have any questions or anything, make sure that you email me, or go to the office hours slide that I had posted at the beginning of the year. It's in the classwork materials. Go to that slide and click on the links, pop into the Google Meets that I have every day. Some days are scheduled for Euro, some for US, some for History of Rock and Roll. But if you really have a question, you need to get in touch with me, and you're in US history, but today is a Euro Google Meet day. If you really have a question and emailing me won't address that question, please feel free to click on the link to whatever the proper day's Google Class or Google Meet is. And if you have a question, I want to help you however, we can do that, whether it's through a Meet, through an email, phone call, whatever the case is. But if you have questions, please make sure that you get in touch with me, because if you have a question, you're never going to find out the answer to the question until you ask. All right, well, that's all I've got for today, so I will talk to you later.